Hello again and welcome back to another Python tutorial episode. Now first of all, I promised I'd give you the answer to the question I posed in a previous tutorial, and that was why the specs label was below the coding label when the specs label had clearly been indicated as anchor equals north, so the top center of the screen, whereas the coding label had been put to the west. Now the answer to this conundrum is simply linked to the order in which we've written out our labels and packed them on our screen. As you can see, we've packed label 1 first. So what that means is it will take up, given that we've said expand equals true, the whole horizontal space we've managed to allocate it, namely the top half of our screen. So once we pack label 2, even though we say anchor equals north, that is only relative. Namely, it's relative to the amount of space we've left for our label, which is basically reduced to the bottom half of the screen. So as you can see, our specs label is actually to the north, namely the top center position, of the bottom half of our window. If we wanted the specs label to genuinely be to the north of our screen, then we would have had to pack it first before label 1. Now that we've seen the answer to that question and gone through 2 episodes on the pack command, let's see a different way of managing the geometry of our layout. This uses the grid command. As I'm sure you can imagine, the grid command allows us to place our elements on our screen as if they were within a grid. For example, we could write label1 dot grid, and this can have column equals 1 and row equals 1. And then we can also give it some padding. Pad x equals 5, pad y equals 5, and then ipad x equals 10, and ipad y equals 10. Then, as always, we can copy this line and paste it twice more for our label 2 and label 3. And in this case, we can write column 2, row 2, and column 3, row 3. And if we run the code, we can see that we have now successfully placed our 3 labels in a diagonal, namely in column 1, row 1, in column 2, row 2, and column 3, row 3. We can, of course, configure these columns using a special command. We can write, for example, up here before we define our labels, root dot column configure, surprise, surprise, and this will be 0, and then weight equals 1. And then we can write again root dot column configure, for example, 2 weight equals 5. Now what this means is we've configured 2 of our columns, column 0 and column 2, to each have a weight of 1 and 5 respectively. Now you have to consider that this weight parameter is actually relative, namely each of the columns is dependent on the value of the others. So weight equals 1 is our default value, and then weight equals 5 is the new value which we give to column number 2. This basically means that column 2 will be 5 times as wide as column 1. So now if we run the code, we can see that column 2, which is our third column in our series, because of course we have column 0, column 1, column 2, and column 3. Column 2 specifically is significantly larger than either column 1 or column 3, or indeed column 0, which in this case is not populated by any labels. How much wider do you say? Well, 5 times as wide. Now let's slightly amend our code by removing the ipad value, namely the internal padding, Within the Tkinter library, by default, when a cell, or in other words the allocated space for a label, is larger than the label it contains, the grid geometry manager, let's say, in this case grid, will place the label at the center of the cell both horizontally and vertically. To change this behavior, we can use the sticky command. I know this sounds a bit funny, but as per other parameters we've seen, it can have different values, namely north, south, east, and west, and of course, once again, northwest or top left, northeast, top right, southeast, bottom right, southwest, bottom left, and then there are two special values which only the sticky parameter has, which is ns, namely north-south, and EW, namely east-west, and each of these stretch the label vertically for north-south and horizontally for east-west. You can see this clearly in the two diagrams I've shown you here. We of course have northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, then the four normal parameters north, west, south, and east, and in addition in the two rectangles you can see north, south, and east, west. With that, and with the sticky command in particular, we have come to the end of today's episode. As always, I invite you to check out my other tutorials on Python as well as my coding challenges. As always, I look forward to seeing you all next week for another video. And until then, happy coding!